A thought experiment. Just imagine we had the recording of a 6-year-old Israeli girl desperately ringing the emergency services after Hamas militants had slaughtered her relatives in a car, including 3 of the children. Imagine we also had a prior recording of her 15-year-old cousin desperately pleading for help before you hear her being violently murdered by Hamas gunfire. Imagine then an Israeli ambulance sent to rescue this little girl was then blown up by Hamas militants, killing both paramedics. What would be the response? Well, I think you know what the response would be. It would be offered up as evidence of the supreme evil and barbarism of Hamas. We would be told that it proved that they are worse than the Nazis. It would also be offered up as justification for the need to wipe Hamas off the face of the earth. Every politician in the West would issue statements dripping with grief and righteous fury. But you see, this horror did happen to a girl, a 6-year-old girl, called Hind Rajab, and her family and the paramedics who were sent to rescue her. But those killed were all Palestinians, and those that killed them were Israeli soldiers. So, fiery denunciations of the supreme evil and barbarism of the Israeli Defense Force, they didn't happen. Nor did statements from politicians dripping with grief and righteous fury. Instead, the West continues to arm and back Israel's mass slaughter with occasional hand-wringing, which its politicians know has zero impact on the behaviour of Israel. Even as Israel commits some of the worst atrocities of the 21st century, live-streamed for the whole world to see, these Western powers refuse to describe a single act committed by the Israeli state as a war crime. Now, 2 things. Firstly, none of this is to downgrade the value of Israeli civilian life. The value attached to Israeli innocent civilian life is absolutely correct. It just transparently is not applied to Palestinian life. Indeed, secondly, it is nauseating that I even have to indulge in these imaginative scenarios. It becomes necessary because Palestinian life has been stripped of nearly all value. Let's just consider the media coverage of the slaughter by the Israeli state of Hind, her young cousins, her aunt, her uncle, and the courageous paramedics who went to save her. The New York Times headline: missing 6-year-old and rescue team found dead in Gaza, aid group says. Found dead? How? Who killed her and the rescue team? Were they all struck by lightning? Or CNN, their headline: 5-year-old Palestinian girl found dead after being trapped in car with dead relatives. Absolutely incredible. Wild. No sense whatsoever there was any form of violence here. They were simply found dead. After some online uproar, CNN amended their headline to 5-year-old Palestinian girl found dead after being trapped in car under Israeli fire. Now, as the media critic Adam Johnson put it, it's been updated to vaguely, maybe sort of ascribe guilt, but it still doesn't. CNN, as a rule, can no longer just say Israel killed X until after the IDF takes credit, so we must now torture the English language to the point of parody. This is racism. It's not even subtle racism. Footage yesterday circulated of a Palestinian mother and her child lying together in the street. The mother was dead, killed by an Israeli sniper, while the child was seriously injured. Whether he survives, uncertain. Because of the snipers, Palestinians battled to rescue the child. They were under fire as they did, eventually doing so at arm's length using a wooden plank. If that footage was from October 7th, and it was an Israeli mother and child murdered and maimed by Hamas bullets, it would be treated as one of the most traumatic examples of the horrors that day. That footage would be on loop on news channels and would be used again to make the case about the sheer barbarism of Hamas and why them remaining in power was simply intolerable. There is nothing subtle about the total degradation of the value of Palestinian life. Which brings me on to Aviva Klompas. Now, you may have seen her on social media. She's a former speechwriter for Israel's mission to the United Nations. She's now a key influencer, one of the most important propagandists in Israel's digital comms war. The day after it was confirmed that the badly decomposing bodies of 6-year-old Hind and her family had been recovered, and with footage circulating of that Palestinian woman executed by an Israeli sniper, her grievously injured child writhing on the floor next to her, she posted an article from the 25th of October. Now, the article itself, I should emphasise, has lower journalistic standards than the average Reddit comment. In the tweet, she writes, "New evidence from October 7th suggests Arab women and children were among the attackers and partook in murdering Israeli civilians." Why is she posting that now then? What's the function of it? If it isn't clear, I read the article and it reads as follows. The commonly accepted version of the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel depicts a first wave of well-trained Hamas terrorists who quickly went about murdering Israeli soldiers and civilians, and was followed by a wave of irregulars from Gaza eager to share in the killings. This version depicts women and children from the Gaza Strip among the collateral victims of Israel's counterattack, which is still levelling buildings and terrorist infrastructures up and down the Strip. But a more accurate version of the massacre is beginning to emerge on social networks, suggesting Arab women and children were among the attackers and partook in murdering Israeli civilians. Well, I'm not going to mince my words here. Aviva Klompas needs to be investigated under the provisions of the 1948 Genocide Convention under incitement. What was the function of this post? Other than to deflect fury and grief away from the slaughter of innocent children and women, who make up the majority of civilians killed in Gaza, by suggesting that they are terrorists and therefore legitimate military targets, to make the case that essentially anyone in Gaza is a legitimate military target, that they all have some form of collective guilt. Now, this influencer, I might add, has her posts regularly shared by mainstream British journalists, truly hurtling down the moral abyss. Now, in South Africa's submission to the ICJ, this horror in Gaza was described as the world's first live-streamed genocide. I think even more than that, it's the live streaming of the suicide of the West. Much of the world already regarded the West's claims of moral superiority with contempt. Well, contempt doesn't even begin to describe those sentiments now. I don't think it's even remotely appreciated just how much fury at Western power there is. That Western power, by the way, which has shrunk with every major conflict involving Muslim nations in the 21st century. Specifically by the absolutely relentless examples of absolutely heinous atrocities, mass murder, war crimes on a colossal scale, being defended and armed by Western governments and cheered on and apologised for by Western media outlets. Probably the biggest mass radicalisation event in history, the consequences of which will be felt gruesomely so for a very, very long time. Indeed, there is much triumphalism today at the rescue of 2 Israeli hostages. The price? Dozens slaughtered in the aerial bombardment of Rafah, where most of Gaza's population have been driven to. Many of those slaughtered, children, babies. We know, of course, that the Israeli army has killed more hostages than it has rescued. We know that a ceasefire secured the mass release of hostages. But what we see here, vividly, grimly, is how Palestinian life is valued somewhere between a housefly and a garden ant. Now, the thing is, it's extremely clear that those who defended Israel's mass slaughter know they have lost any meaningful moral high ground. They know deep down that this whole episode is now beyond depraved. So you can see them desperately lashing around, scouring the internet for anything they can, something, to claim that the real dangerous, hateful extremists are those who oppose massacring little children. Well, they're running out of road with that strategy. I think deep down they kind of know that. Because they will never, ever, ever be able to claim moral high ground on anything ever again after this. But finally, this nauseating episode, that is everything that's happened in the last 128 days, has answered a question that I've always been haunted by when studying the atrocities of the past. How did so many people who regarded themselves as humane, moderate, normal, become so willingly complicit in self-evident evil, either by not speaking out or by actively cheering it on? Well, I think of the badly decomposing remains of Hind and her family, and the incinerated remains of the paramedics sent to save her. And there's the answer. There's the answer. Please like and subscribe. Do share the video. Leave your comments. Keep the show on the road on patreon.com/OwnJones84. Listen to some podcast. Speak to you soon.